It all started on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I had walked into the office with a sense of purpose, ready to tackle the day's tasks. I had stayed up late the night before to perfect a presentation that I had been working on for weeks. I knew how important it was to get it right. This project wasn't just another task. It was a chance to prove myself, to show my boss and the team what I was capable of. I was nervous, of course, but there's a difference between being nervous and being ready, and I was ready. As the meeting began, my boss, who was known for his sharp tongue and unpredictable temper, glanced over the presentation briefly. I took a deep breath and started walking the team through the slides, explaining each point clearly, anticipating questions, and making sure every detail was precise. I could see a few colleagues nodding, some even smiling, and for a moment, I felt confident. I thought maybe today will go well. And then it happened. Without warning, my boss stopped me mid-sentence. His voice was sharp, louder than it needed to be, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. He started pointing out mistakes that weren't there, or at least not in the way he described. He questioned my competence, mocked my approach, and used words that cut deeper than I could have imagined. "Is this the best you can do?" he asked, sarcastically. I expected more from someone in your position. The tone wasn't just critical. It was degrading, public humiliation in its purest form. I froze for a moment. My heart was pounding, and my mind raced, trying to process the shock. I could feel my face burning, a mix of anger, embarrassment, and disbelief. Colleagues looked away awkwardly, unsure of where to focus. Some avoided eye contact entirely, others whispered quietly, and I could see the sympathy in a few eyes. But the humiliation wasn't softened. If anything, it was magnified by the silence around me. The words continued, each one piercing a little deeper. He criticized every aspect of the work I had done, ignoring all the effort, the late nights, and the sacrifices I had made to get it done perfectly. It felt like all my hard work, all the hours I had poured into this project, were erased in a few cruel sentences. I could feel my chest tighten, the familiar pang of self-doubt creeping in, but underneath it all, there was a fire, a tiny, flickering flame that refused to be extinguished. I remember the exact moment he laughed, a sharp, almost triumphant laugh, and the team shifted uncomfortably in their seats. It was a performance, and I was unwillingly cast as the fool. I wanted to defend myself, to shout back, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. The shock and the sheer audacity of the humiliation had paralyzed me. I realized then that reacting in anger would only give him more control. My silence became my shield. The meeting dragged on, each minute stretching longer than the last. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, frustration, disbelief, and embarrassment, but there was also clarity. This wasn't just a one-time criticism, it was a deliberate attempt to assert power, to undermine my confidence in front of others. He wanted me small, defeated, and visible as a cautionary example to everyone else. And for a fleeting moment, I hated him. I hated the injustice, the cruelty, and the helplessness that washed over me like cold water. When the meeting finally ended, I gathered my things slowly, carefully, feeling the weight of every glance from my colleagues. Some offered sympathetic smiles, others avoided me entirely, and I realized that the humiliation I felt was not mine alone. It lingered in the air, in the room, and in the memory of everyone present. Walking back to my desk, I tried to hold my composure, though the storm inside me was anything but calm. I felt small, yet oddly aware of my own strength. That moment, humiliating, painful, and public, became a turning point. It was the kind of experience that could break someone, or it could forge them into something stronger. And I realized, even in that instant of crushing shame, that I had a choice to let this moment define me or to rise above it. The humiliation was real, the sting was deep, but it also planted the first seed of determination that would later become my quiet, unstoppable revenge. After that day in the meeting, I returned to my desk feeling like the world had shifted beneath me. The humiliation I experienced wasn't just a fleeting sting. It clung to me, like a weight pressing on my shoulders. My heart was still racing, and my mind replayed every cruel word, every mocking tone, over and over. I could feel anger bubbling, resentment simmering, and an overwhelming urge to confront him, to yell, to fight back. But as the minutes passed, I realized that reaction would only serve his purpose. Reacting impulsively would let him control the narrative. It would give him the satisfaction of knowing he had wounded me deeply. I sat there for a long time, staring at my screen, pretending to be busy while my mind was racing. I thought about everything I had invested in this job: long hours, missed dinners with family, countless sacrifices. And the bitter reality hit me despite all of that. Respect had not been given, only taken away, and it dawned on me that I had reached a crossroads. I could either stay, continue under the constant risk of humiliation, or walk away and reclaim my sense of dignity. The decision was not easy. Leaving meant uncertainty, stepping into the unknown, risking financial stability, and confronting my own fears of failure. But the alternative, staying in a toxic environment where my worth was constantly undermined, felt worse. I realized that no paycheck, no title, no temporary security was worth sacrificing my self-respect. I had spent too long seeking validation from someone who was incapable of giving it. As I sat there contemplating, I remembered every time I had swallowed my pride, every time I had let criticism slide, hoping to earn approval that never came. The memory of each insult, each sarcastic remark, fueled a quiet but steady resolve. I didn't want revenge born out of petty anger. I wanted power born out of self-respect, strength built on my own terms, and freedom defined by my own choices. Walking away would be an act of courage, not cowardice. The next morning, I made my decision. I didn't storm into my boss's office or announce it dramatically to the team. I didn't feel the need to prove anything right away. I simply began the process of leaving with dignity. I started documenting my work, ensuring that everything I had contributed was clearly visible and organized. I reached out to colleagues I trusted, not for sympathy, but to ensure a smooth transition. Every step I took was deliberate, a reflection of the self-respect I was reclaiming. Walking away was liberating in a way I hadn't anticipated. The fear that had been gripping me, the fear of losing my job, of disappointing others, of failing, began to fade. I felt a lightness I hadn't known in months, the sense that I was no longer trapped by someone else's cruelty. Each day, the anger and humiliation from that meeting became less about what he had done and more about what I was about to do with my own life. I was choosing me, choosing my dignity, choosing growth over resentment. It wasn't just a physical decision to leave the office. It was an emotional declaration. I was saying to myself and to the world that no one had the right to diminish my worth. I realized that walking away wasn't running from the problem. It was taking control. I wasn't powerless anymore. I had chosen the path where I could emerge stronger, sharper, and more respected, even if it took time to get there. By the end of that week, I had officially handed in my resignation. The act itself felt small, almost mundane, but the courage it represented was monumental. I knew there would be whispers, questions, and maybe even ridicule from some corners, but I didn't care. The fear of staying in humiliation was far worse than the fear of stepping into the unknown. And deep down, I knew that leaving wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far greater, a quiet, calculated journey toward reclaiming my power. That decision, made in the silence of my own resolve, was the moment I shifted from being a victim to being someone in control. I had refused to let humiliation define me. I had chosen the hard, brave path of self-respect over comfort, freedom over fear, and strength over submission. And little did I know, this single decision would set the stage for an outcome far more powerful than I could have imagined. An outcome where respect, once denied, would eventually be demanded. After making the decision to walk away, I realized that leaving alone wouldn't be enough. The real power wasn't just in quitting. It was in how I carried myself in the aftermath. I understood that this wasn't a situation that could be fixed by immediate confrontation, angry texts, or social media posts. Every reaction I made in those days had the potential either to diminish me further or to strengthen the position I was building for myself. That's when I embraced the idea of strategic silence. At first, it felt unnatural. I wanted to lash out, to tell everyone in the office what had happened, to make him feel the same embarrassment I felt. I imagined conversations where I would recount every insult, expose the unfairness, and demand recognition for the hard work he had so carelessly dismissed. But the more I imagined it, the clearer it became reacting in anger would only make me a participant in his narrative. It would allow him to control the story, and I refused to let that happen, so I chose silence. Not the kind that comes from fear or submission, but the kind that comes from deliberate power. I stopped engaging in office gossip, I refrained from venting to colleagues, and I avoided the urge to justify myself to anyone. Every time I felt the need to speak, I paused and reminded myself that restraint in those moments was far more valuable than the fleeting satisfaction of immediate retaliation. My silence became a shield, a quiet statement that my worth was not defined by his words or by anyone else's opinion. During those 2 weeks, I noticed the subtle changes around me. My absence was already being felt in ways I hadn't anticipated. Projects that had been seamless under my oversight were suddenly facing delays. Colleagues who had once relied on my guidance were struggling, unsure how to proceed. And yet, I didn't gloat or make a show of my quiet power. I simply observed, keeping my dignity intact while letting reality speak for itself. Strategic silence also meant focusing on what I could control. Instead of obsessing over what my boss thought or how he might respond, I dedicated my energy to growth, opportunity, and preparation. I polished skills that had been neglected, explored professional connections, and strengthened my personal brand. While the office buzzed with speculation and curiosity about why I had stepped back, I was quietly building momentum. My silence wasn't empty. It was purposeful, a form of action disguised as stillness. There was a deep emotional component to this silence as well. It gave me time to process the humiliation I had endured, to confront my own insecurities, and to reaffirm my self-worth. Instead of reacting impulsively, I allowed myself to reflect, to understand the bigger picture, and to recognize that the need for validation from someone who had disrespected me was misplaced. By withholding my voice, I reclaimed power over my emotions, refusing to hand over control to someone else's cruelty. I also learned an important truth. During this time, silence commands attention. The absence of my usual contributions, the lack of engagement in the office chatter, the calm composure I maintained despite the chaos, it all spoke louder than words ever could. People started noticing my absence, realizing that the work they had taken for granted depended on my presence and expertise. I didn't have to demand recognition, it came naturally through the reality of my impact. Strategic silence was not passive. It was a calculated, deliberate choice. I was actively observing, analyzing, and preparing for the next steps. Every day, I measured my progress, refined my skills, and reminded myself that true power often lies in restraint. There was a subtle sense of satisfaction in knowing that while I appeared quiet and composed, I was quietly gaining an advantage that no angry confrontation could provide. By the end of those 2 weeks, the effects of my silence were undeniable. My absence had created ripples, making it clear to everyone, especially my boss, that my contributions were not just appreciated, they were indispensable. I had turned what initially felt like a setback into an opportunity to demonstrate resilience, intelligence, and foresight. The very people who had witnessed my humiliation were now witnessing a quiet strength, one that demanded respect without a single word of complaint. Strategic silence became my secret weapon. It taught me patience, control, and the subtle art of influence. I realized that sometimes the loudest statements are made not with words, but with action, composure, and the quiet knowledge of one's own worth. By staying silent, I had not only preserved my dignity, but had positioned myself to return in a way that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. Once I had chosen silence and taken the step away from my toxic environment, I realized that my next move needed to be constructive. The humiliation I endured had left a mark, but I refused to let it define me. Instead of dwelling on anger or resentment, I decided to invest every ounce of energy into myself. I knew that true power, the kind that cannot be taken away or diminished by someone else, comes from growth, skill, and confidence. The first thing I did was identify my weaknesses, not in the way my boss had pointed them out, but objectively, honestly, and with purpose. I analyzed my work, my approach to communication, and the skills that I could improve to not only become indispensable, but also untouchable in my professional environment. I enrolled in online courses, watched tutorials, and reached out to mentors who had walked paths I aspired to follow. Every hour I spent learning was a quiet declaration that I was rising above the humiliation rather than letting it anchor me in defeat. Simultaneously, I worked on my emotional strength. I practiced mindfulness and reflection, allowing myself to process the anger and pain without letting them control my decisions. Journaling became a daily habit, where I poured out frustrations and then reframed them into lessons. What had initially felt like the end of my career or the loss of respect slowly transformed into fuel for personal growth. Each reflection, each insight, built layers of resilience I hadn't known I possessed. I also focused on expanding my professional network. I reached out to people whose work I admired, shared ideas, and even offered assistance on projects where I could make a meaningful contribution. Unlike the office, where recognition had been conditional and fleeting, this network valued skills, collaboration, and integrity. In these interactions, I realized that my value wasn't tied to one person's opinion. The more I connected, the more opportunities opened up, and the more my confidence grew. I was no longer just surviving. I was thriving in new spaces, unseen by the very person who had tried to diminish me. Another key part of my self-improvement journey was reclaiming my sense of identity and self-worth. The humiliation had been public, but my life, my goals, and my aspirations were private and powerful. I exercised discipline in every area: health, communication, time management, turning small, daily improvements into a compounding effect. I read books, listened to podcasts, and reflected on leadership principles that could one day place me in a position far above where I had been. Every step forward was a reminder that I was more than the label he had tried to pin on me. During those 2 weeks, I also practiced envisioning outcomes. I imagined not just returning to work, but returning as someone who had grown so much that my absence would be impossible to ignore. I visualized confidence radiating from my actions, the respect of colleagues, and the humility of my boss when he realized what he had lost. This mental preparation was crucial because it turned hope into intention. I wasn't waiting for external validation. I was creating the circumstances where recognition would naturally follow. Even small victories became significant milestones. A new skill mastered, a mentor's acknowledgement, a connection made. Each achievement added to a growing sense of empowerment. The humiliation that once felt overwhelming began to shrink in comparison to the sense of pride I was cultivating. I realized that revenge didn't have to be dramatic or vindictive. It could be the subtle, undeniable proof of one's growth and capability. By the end of the 2 weeks, the transformation was undeniable, not just externally but internally. I carried myself differently, spoke with more confidence, and approached challenges with a mindset of solutions rather than fear. My boss had tried to break me, but in reality, he had unknowingly set the stage for my evolution. What he saw as a setback became my stepping stone. I had turned 2 weeks of pain and uncertainty into a period of intense self-improvement, creating momentum that no one could ignore. In the quiet hours of reflection, I realized the power of this growth. It was not loud, it was not flashy, but it was unstoppable. Every skill I had learned, every connection I had built, every bit of confidence I had reclaimed was a foundation for the next stage of my journey. The humiliation had been the catalyst, but self-improvement was the true engine that would eventually lead to the moment where I would return, not out of desperation, but as someone stronger, wiser, and undeniably valuable. 2 weeks after I walked away, life had shifted in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. I had poured my energy into self-improvement, growth, and preparation, and the results were already beginning to surface. What I hadn't realized at first was how visible my absence would make me. My presence at work had been so integral, so quietly reliable, that once I was gone, the cracks started to appear almost immediately. Tasks that had seemed seamless suddenly faced delays, decisions became slower, and the efficiency of the team faltered. The impact of my work was undeniable, and yet I wasn't there, watching quietly from a distance as the reality sank in. It started with small messages from colleagues, a casual text asking for guidance, a call from someone struggling with a project I had overseen, a subtle acknowledgement that my role was far more significant than they had realized. These small interactions reminded me that my value wasn't just a matter of perception. It was tangible and measurable. The very work my boss had dismissed so publicly now demonstrated that it was indispensable. And I was no longer the one under pressure. The pressure had shifted. Then came the first sign that my boss was noticing in a more direct way. A meeting that I would normally have led began without me, and I could hear through colleagues that he was scrambling, asking questions he normally wouldn't need to, and making decisions he wasn't confident about. I didn't intervene. I didn't correct anything, but the stories reached me, almost like a confirmation of everything I had hoped for. My silence and absence were now speaking volumes, and the weight of my contributions became impossible for him to ignore. As the days passed, the recognition of my importance became more pronounced. Projects stalled, deadlines risked being missed, and my boss began to feel the consequences of underestimating me. There were mistakes made that could have been prevented if I had been there, and each of these missteps highlighted not only my skills, but also the respect and foresight I had consistently brought to the table. I realized that success isn't always loud or obvious. It often emerges quietly, in the gaps left when someone who is truly capable steps away. Unexpectedly, the attention I had received outside the office started to pay off as well. Opportunities began to appear. Messages from industry peers, offers to collaborate on projects, even recognition for the work I had done prior to leaving. While I had focused on improving myself and expanding my network, these connections now served as tangible evidence that my value extended far beyond a single workplace. I wasn't just essential to that office, I was becoming unstoppable, with doors opening, because I had invested in myself instead of seeking validation from someone else. The pivotal moment arrived when I realized my absence had created a void that no one else could fill. Tasks that had seemed simple without me became chaotic, and it became clear that my boss had overestimated his own capabilities. The very environment that had humiliated me now depended on the skills, judgment, and reliability that I had honed over years. This shift was not just satisfying, it was transformative. My success was no longer contingent on external recognition. It was evident in the undeniable impact of my absence. It was at this point that I understood the true nature of revenge through growth. I hadn't needed to confront him directly or prove my worth with anger. Instead, I had quietly built something far stronger: undeniable capability, respect earned through action, and results that could not be ignored. Every success I achieved, every problem I solved for others, every recognition I received externally, became a reminder that power often comes not from confrontation but from consistent, measured effort. By the end of those 2 weeks, what had started as humiliation and despair had transformed into an unexpected triumph. I had grown in skill, confidence, and influence in ways that my boss could not have anticipated. My absence had created an undeniable gap. My growth had strengthened my position, and my value was no longer something that could be dismissed lightly. The humiliation that had once felt crushing became the catalyst for a quiet, powerful success that spoke louder than any words ever could. In that moment, I realized that revenge isn't about immediate gratification. It's about creating conditions where your worth becomes so evident that others are forced to acknowledge it. The 2 weeks of focus, effort, and patience had culminated in something greater than any confrontation could have achieved: a success so unexpected, so undeniable, that it demanded recognition and shifted the balance of power entirely. The moment I had been quietly preparing for finally arrived. 2 weeks after walking away and investing in myself, I received a call from my boss. At first, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to continue enjoying the freedom and growth I had cultivated. But there was something in the tone of his voice that immediately caught my attention: urgency, desperation, and a humility I had never heard before. He was asking to meet, and though I had every right to dismiss him, I agreed. Walking into the office that day, I felt a strange mixture of calm and anticipation. This was no longer about fear, resentment, or the anger I had felt during that humiliating meeting. This was about power, self-respect, and the undeniable proof of my growth. I had changed in 2 weeks, skills sharpened, confidence restored, and perspective realigned, and it was reflected in every step I took. I wasn't returning as the person he could belittle. I was returning as someone who had quietly proven her worth in ways he hadn't imagined. When I met him, his posture, usually rigid and confident, was different. There was an awkwardness in his demeanor, a tension in the air that hadn't existed before. He began with apologies, acknowledging the way he had humiliated me and admitting that he had underestimated my contributions. But it wasn't the apology itself that struck me. It was the realization that he was now dependent on the very skills and qualities he had tried to dismiss. His tone conveyed humility mixed with urgency, a subtle acknowledgement that he needed me, not as a subordinate he could control, but as a professional he could no longer afford to ignore. He began explaining the difficulties the team had faced in my absence, the delays, the confusion, and the lack of clear direction. Every word he spoke reinforced what I had already known: my work, my dedication, and my presence were far more valuable than he had realized. For the first time, the power dynamic had shifted. He was no longer the one in control. I held the position of influence through the undeniable impact I had created outside and inside the office. As I listened, I could feel the subtle shift in the room. Colleagues who had witnessed my humiliation earlier now glanced at me with a newfound respect, quietly acknowledging the transformation that had taken place. I wasn't the same person who had endured 2 weeks of demeaning treatment. I was stronger, confident, and composed, and that presence alone spoke volumes. My silence, my growth, and my strategic absence had built a reputation that no apology or plea could erase. When he finally asked if I would consider returning, I paused. I wasn't angry, I wasn't spiteful, but I held the power of choice. I could see clearly that his request was not just for convenience. It was an acknowledgement of my value, a validation of my abilities, and a recognition of the respect I had earned. The roles were reversed. He was now the one seeking approval, hoping that I would bring back the stability and competence he had taken for granted. In that moment, I realized that this comeback wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. It wasn't about making him suffer or humiliating him in return. It was about reclaiming dignity and demonstrating that respect and capability are earned, not demanded. I had built a position where my absence had created consequences, my growth had proven my strength, and my self-respect had made me untouchable by mere words. The ultimate satisfaction was not in his apology, but in the undeniable fact that he now saw my worth through the lens of necessity and admiration. Returning, or choosing not to return, was now entirely my decision. I could negotiate terms that reflected my true value, assert boundaries that had once been ignored, and step into a role where I was respected rather than controlled. The humiliation of 2 weeks ago no longer had power over me. I had transformed pain into progress, mockery into motivation, and a moment of public shame into a demonstration of resilience and growth. As I walked out of that meeting, I felt a sense of quiet triumph. I had not sought revenge through confrontation, insults, or bitterness. I had achieved it through patience, strategy, and self-improvement. The boss who once humiliated me was now the one begging, humbled and aware of the talent he had almost lost. The power shift was complete, not because I had defeated him in argument, but because I had become indispensable through my own effort, resilience, and confidence. That comeback was more than a return. It was a testament to the principle that true respect and success are earned, not given. It was proof that even the deepest humiliation can be transformed into opportunity if met with courage, patience, and deliberate action. 2 weeks had changed everything, and in that change, I had found the ultimate form of victory: quiet, undeniable, and profoundly empowering.